Welcome to the ZoomInfo Labs podcast. I'm Ben Salzman.
And I'm Millie Beetham. Today's guest is Lauren Silvers, Director of Go-to-Market Programs at Ironclad.
Lauren's career has taken her from management consulting to leading sales enablement programs at LinkedIn, Intercom, and now Ironclad.
Lauren shares her learnings from academia and how she's applying them to run successful go-to-market strategies at scale. Lauren is an experienced operator. She shares her tips for effective sales programs, her takes on signal-based selling, and tactical advice for enablement and change management. This episode is a must listen. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the ZoomInfo Labs podcast. I'm Ben Salzman.
And I'm Millie Beetham.
Today we have a very special guest. Today we have Lauren Silvers, who to me is one of the most thoughtful and capable people in all of go-to-market. Excited to have you on the podcast to hear about your journey, especially because you come from a very non-traditional background, but you've truly inspired me with the way that you think about go-to-market enablement, sales programs, and beyond. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and to be in conversation with both you and Millie.
So Lauren, you started off your career in management consulting. How did you first decide to pivot into go-to-market, and tell us about that sort of moment when you decided that you were going to go on a new journey?
Yeah, so my consulting practice was really focused on a few different areas: sales strategy, operations, and organizational effectiveness consulting. And so I was really focused on helping Fortune 1000 companies achieve sales productivity through role optimization and competency development. And so, it was very much like a strengths-based approach, really about understanding the company's strategy and really looking at the internal capabilities and trying to align those two. Like LinkedIn actually reached out to me to lead their sales excellence program, which was competency-based, because they knew about my organizational effectiveness consulting background. So I decided to move to LinkedIn and go in-house and build their sales excellence program, which eventually became their blueprint program, which was eventually scaled across all lines of business. So it was very, very successful. And it was really about identifying the DNA of the best-in-class customer-oriented seller and scaling best practices and scaling what we know works when we meet buyers where they are in their buying journey and lead with value selling best practices in every customer interaction.
Wow. It's just amazing. I feel like you started there and then went on to do like so many of these programs, right? Maybe talk about like how you're bringing some of that into Ironclad now.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, everything that I have learned, I bring every day. Like it's just an accumulation. But I'm always thinking from an enablement perspective, from a strengths-based perspective, and really trying to keep those competencies that I know, again, define the DNA of a best-in-class seller top of mind. So I think a lot of people in my particular role right now with Ironclad sales programs, they're really thinking about operationalizing like a pipeline engine and delivering sales plays to the field. I always think about how I'm helping reps leverage the skills that I know they need to continue to cultivate, the behaviors I know they need to continue to exercise in the flow of their work. So I'm always operating from that dual perspective of strengths and capabilities and the actual activities and actions that they need to do to achieve their goals.
I want to talk a little bit about sort of your experience in sort of working across these multiple companies. And you just spoke a little bit about your like different frameworks that you bring along. Like what's your framework for making sure like all of those things stick, right? When you actually go into an organization, right? How do they create that sustained impact when you're there?
Yeah, so obviously this is about change management, and change management is critically important with any new initiative. And I've had the pleasure of standing up a few new functions at different companies. Stood up go-to-market programs at Intercom, pretty much standing up sales programs right now at Ironclad. And, I would say that there's a stepwise approach. Like the first part of standing up any function or creating any initiative is getting buy-in and commitment on the impact story that you want to tell. And when I say impact story, it's a vision, it's an elongated vision statement. Like, let's step into the future and think about what we want to accomplish with this initiative or with this function. Then you have to get all of your key stakeholders bought in. I feel like I'm, saying things that are obvious, but I think that they're not often done in a very strategic, intentional way. For me, it's all about earning the trust and the, just support of the sales organization, sales leaders, from the executives all the way down to the frontline managers. If every single sales leader is not bought into what you're actually doing, you're going to the whole thing just falls apart, So it's not just about aligning with execs and saying, here's what you need to do. It's about creating that vision, right? Telling a story where honestly, every word counts, right? Every aspect of that story counts. And then also, I think it's really important to align key metrics to that vision statement, that story, that that you can measure in terms of signals, like kind of the greenest shoots, the first indicators that that the initiative is going well, behaviors and activities that would indicate that there's adoption of the initiative, and then leading indicators and lagging indicators. So obviously leading sales metrics, lagging sales metrics, and supporting that story with those metrics versus saying, hey, we're going to do this initiative, we've got executive buy-in, and now we're just going to measure success in this more abstract way. The story needs to be told with this supporting evidence. And in a former life, I was a literature professor, so I feel like my approach is very much informed by that. But it has been an approach that I think has been, repeatable and very successful.
I want to dig in just a little bit on the literature background. So can we talk about this sort of from academia to technology and SaaS, and how did that happen for you? Why the transition, and what have you learned along the way?
Yeah, so I have a prior background as a director in business. So I was actually, negotiating contracts for a living with Procter and Gamble and W Magazine and Prada. I was in the fashion industry. And then long story short, I made a major career pivot after 9/11. I went and got my PhD at University of Chicago in comparative literature and learned 2 new languages while I was there, and learned so much. Grew so much. And then ultimately I was teaching as well. And so I think what I realized that I love to do is always have a vertical learning curve and a set of really extreme challenges in front of me. I don't balk when I'm faced with a challenge. I tend to just, throw myself into it and get really excited about it. I also don't balk when I'm faced with constraints either. I think of them as ways of defining a problem and the opportunity to work through and with those constraints to build something great. So to answer your question, I kind of came to the end of a really great postdoc where I was teaching, and the jobs in literature were drying up in my field. And I walked across the street to the business school and started just nerding out with the MBAs who are doing case interviewing. And so I did that for about 6 months. I took on a mentor in the consulting field, and now the rest is history.
So Lauren, there's been so much that you've shared in terms of your journey and this sort of general red thread around going in, adjusting or building new functions, moving through change management. We want to learn a little bit of, your lessons, right, being an operator in this field. So let's start with, what have you discovered by sort of effectively embedding some of these go-to-market programs into sellers' daily workflows, et cetera? What are some of the things that you've learned? What are some of the common things that leaders and the sellers maybe miss?
Yeah, so I would say go-to-market programs is a relatively new function that, enablement was usually the function where they were leading with change management, leading initiatives that would be embedded into the field. There's this standard focus on reinforcement of knowledge and sustainment of, a program over time. And I think go-to-market programs has the opportunity to do something a little bit different. If we think about the context in which we're asking reps to operate on a daily basis, it's ever changing, it's getting ever complex. We're always putting the burden on the reps to learn new tools, to do new things, to, write new notes in the CRM or do things differently. As we think about all the changes that they have to deal with. And go-to-market programs, I think, is uniquely positioned to essentially change the infrastructure and the context in which reps are working every day so they can be more productive and more efficient. And when you change the context in which the behaviors are occurring such that they're becoming kind of the easy default rather than the hard alternative or the thing that, your manager asked you to do and is enforcing you to do, that's when you get true behavior change. That's when you get true habits, like good habits that actually lead to desired outcomes. So go-to-market programs, I see it as a very strategic function that's there to change the infrastructure, change the way things are orchestrated, change the way even functions that are usually siloed kind of interact with one another. And my learnings at Intercom actually were really, when I reflect on those learnings, I realized that we did that really, really well. So we created an entire pipeline engine, right, that was built in the CRM. And, instead of saying, hey, go to this deck and take these plays off the shelf when you, essentially realize that you may want to drive pipeline, you may want to go and look at this play and consume this deck or watch this video. We made it so the plays were delivered in the flow of work where they were easy to execute. They had the MVP of the play ready at hand with links to kind of deeper dives if it was necessary. And it just became a scalable engine of pipeline generation. So that's just one particular example of how go-to-market programs can embed initiatives in a way that's much more sustainable. I won't say it's much more sustainable than enablement or any other function, but it's uniquely situated to, again, optimize that context in which reps are operating in every day.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen some stats on some of those programs you built, and the upsell and cross-sell impact at Intercom was extremely high. So they were super, super successful. I feel like you mentioned a couple of the tactical things that really made those systems super successful. Is there any one hot tip or something that you would say over and over again, I will do this every single time?
I've got the hot tip. It's not really it's a hot tip, but it's not, it's everyone can implement this. It's signal-based selling. So what I mean by that is leveraging your first, second, and third-party data, creating clusters of data points that will translate into an insight that's compelling that a rep can share with a prospect or a customer to drive action. So just by creating the signals and triggering those signals in the flow of work with sales plays, making them data-driven and, doing the work to transform them into insights and messaging that reps can share, you're cutting through the noise. And I think that it's an incredibly noisy environment right now for outbound and outreach in general. I think a lot of the traditional channels that we use to drive outbound are drying up because volume is increasing due to the new trend for AI-driven scaled outbound. And so it's imperative that we find ways to cut through the noise. And I think signal-based selling programs and architecture is one very sustainable way to do that, and a great investment that any go-to-market or RevOps team can make.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously talk about it all the time, but it's funny, Lauren. I feel like a lot of the time and some of our other guests that we've had on the pod, right? They're sort of on to their next sort of executive journey. For example, this season, we're really excited to have some of the operators who are still tactically in the field, building these programs out, leveraging these new strategies. And it's such a good reminder that you say yeah, signal-based selling. Not everybody's doing it yet. We all think like it's been around, the data's been available, and oh, everybody's just like got that on lock. It's embedded into their workflows. They're being really successful with it. And I think what you're calling out is like, no, that's still sort of the criticality that most teams need to approach and still need to take on and make really successful within their organizations. It's a really great reminder, right? Like the 10% is not representative of the 90% that still have so much room, right, to build out those signal-based plays and programs.
Lauren, you've talked about some of the basic tools, right? Sales engagement platforms, certainly signal-based selling. Maybe just from a philosophy standpoint, how do you think about implementing tech that actually drives efficiency and effectiveness and not just tech for tech's sake, right? I think a lot of folks like think, oh, I have a problem, let me go buy a tool, but often that's just like another place for reps to go, et cetera. How do you think about the choices you make from a tech stack perspective to ensure that it actually drives a better outcome versus just like more confusion, another destination?
Yeah, and I am always operating at the very nexus of like, let's bring on another tool. So, I'm kind of at the center of all those conversations. Honestly, what comes to mind is thinking about the buyer's buying process and the buyer's buying journey and making sure that everything that you're doing aligns to that as the kind of keystone of, or the true north, so to speak, of what you need to accomplish. And the reason I say that is because what I see when you bring on all these new tools and you're onboarding new reps onto these tools, and half of them are adopted, half of them aren't, is a lot of inefficiency and just lack of productivity, right? As a result of bringing on these tools. So very inefficient sales processes where, the tools aren't necessary. They're solving one tiny little problem, and they're not actually, like working to solve the bigger problem, which is to make the sales process more efficient, more aligned to the buyer's buying process. And behind that comment, I'll say is, I think one of the biggest, let's say, weaknesses of any RevOps team is the data, right? Data accuracy, data integrity, the rate at which data is refreshed, right? Someone like me who wants to deliver target contact lists enriched with not only the most accurate contact data, but also the data that we know are going to be transformed into those insights that the sellers will use to share with prospects. If I have bad data, I'm not only blowing through my TAM, I'm also, stressing the trusted relationship with my stakeholders, which is sales, right? So if I give them 4 or 5 different target lists and 40% of those contacts are bad, or the data is too hard to find, or it's just not really actually, aligned to the sales play in a really meaningful way, I'm destroying that trust, right? So for me, the tools have to be really aligned to that buyer's buying process. They really have to like serve up accurate data and information. And, they also have to add to that, that infrastructure, that context that we talked about earlier that facilitates the desired behaviors versus adding new tick the box, activities for them to follow.
Makes so much sense. And Lauren, we've made it to this part of the podcast without talking about AI yet, which is quite a accomplishment for all of us. But with that in mind, you served as the go-to-market strategy lead for Intercom's Fin launch, which is like a sort of a big breakthrough and how they were thinking about incorporating AI into their strategy. What did you learn from that launch, and how do you think about, obviously we could go on forever here, but how do you think about the way that AI is going to impact overall sort of go-to-market ops and that idea of bringing products to market?
Yeah, so we were the first to launch like an AI product in the customer support technology space. So that was really exciting. I think one side of the equation is that companies, I've now been at the forefront of 3 AI product launches at 2 different companies. And, adoption at the very beginning is not something that I think companies should expect. and they should, expect a lot of skepticism, a lot of demos that don't actually convert into sales, or very, very small ASPs, because people are still testing these products and testing the solutions and trying to understand, like, will this actually, make my teams more productive or deliver on the value props that the AI products are promising. So there's one piece. But, I think that AI is transforming the go-to-market landscape in so many different ways. One way that I see that's been very successful is just AI. I think ZoomInfo has a really great Copilot product. I'm a huge fan of it. I know I've told you that before, but that Copilot product where you're using AI to kind of optimize the rep workflows, right, in a way that makes their job easier, makes them more productive, helps them spend less time doing research, account planning, messaging crafting messages, so they can spend their time customer facing and spend their time selling well, right? And more targeted. That's where the innovation is right now. And I see a ton of companies, there's Poggio, which is AI, generative AI powered account planning and research. All of the main, gold standard sales enablement tools have their own AI products embedded in their, in their workflows. Sales Navigator has a really great AI account and contact intelligence tool. But I think that AI is transforming that landscape and just going to make it a lot easier for reps to get the information they need almost immediately, so they can lead as trusted advisors with their prospects and their customers. I would say the other way is just, and I'm not sure if I believe in this yet, though, is that AI is now helping sales teams do scaled outbound, right? So we have generative AI kind of doing all the research and crafting the messaging, and in some cases without even a human, kind of sending high volume of outbound to target prospects aligned to specific plays. I personally think that humans want to be able to speak with humans. So I think it's going to be a competitive advantage for companies that really use AI to make humans better at what humans do best, which is engage with other humans, versus like scaling outbound that may or may not be working, just based on, the data and the signals.
Yeah, it's so interesting. There's really like becoming sort of two camps in this, Lauren. And I feel like the use of it to do outbound better, right, and to personalize messaging and to get time back in your day and be more productive, check, right? Like why would I need to write an email when I can have AI write the email for me? Why would I ever need to write a call script if I'm, why would I need to write the in-mail, right? Even leave the voicemail. But I think what's interesting is this concept of it being at scale is really, I feel like, the pivot point. Like, is it going to be at scale, or actually are we going to scale back the number of messages that you need because you're actually going to deliver real value out of the gate, right? You can actually have the time to think about how to do that effectively. And maybe 10 at-bats actually gets you a higher conversion rate than your 100 at-bats, because the quality of the data, right, the automation around that, you having been able to get back 30 to 45 minutes of time to really think about how you're going to craft that message using that data. I think there's an opportunity to really sort of shake that up, which is a great actual segue into sort of this next piece. So Lauren, I think, as you know, like you and I have lived in this sales plays and sales programs intersection for a long time now. There's an active discussion today in tech around there being this sort of emerging role or this function called a go-to-market architect. And so the role is defined as someone who is defining or codifying data-driven targeting and ICP definitions, defining relevant signals, building audiences, aligning teams around plays and programs, and architecting the workflow or process to execute against these revenue generation opportunities. my first question to you is, do you agree that there is a need for this role and this function?
Absolutely. I think every team needs productivity and efficiency, and I think this role is uniquely focused on that. So, absolutely.
Yes, for what it's worth, we're big go-to-market architect fans over here. You, in my mind, are one of them. Like, do you identify as that person in your role today?
I mean, I right now am part of a team of incredibly brilliant go-to-market operators who are all working together to achieve common goal and common purpose. To, our true north is to increase productivity of the sales team in every metric. But I think my role specifically is a little bit different because I operate at the nexus of a lot of different cross-functional relationships. And, a lot of times those functions are working in silos, and they're working on different parts of the funnel, or they're purely operational. And my role helps bring those teams together, brings them into conversation with one another, kind of breaks down those silos, and really forces go-to-market teams to think holistically about topics like the funnel. So, I love that part of the job, because it's not just the pure operator piece, but it's the connector piece too.
And this is a great call out. We've had this conversation of like, are there architects and there are engineers and there are builders, there are operators, like there's sort of this like collection of folks. And right, Lauren, you're saying there's like the cross-functional, somebody who's sort of orchestrating, right, and managing their cross-functional. Then there's the actual sort of true architect who's sort of building up these plays underneath. I have a question, like why, from your perspective, why do you think that there is this critical need for this sort of coming up right now?
Honestly, I think it's part that technology is posing new opportunities that companies, I would say, need to seize on. Otherwise, they're going to lose competitive advantage and market share. And I also think that, there's the rise of revenue operations. And, I think revenue operations are really trying to focus so much, like teams, on those top line metrics and standard operating procedures and just functional alignment. And I think it's just a next generation of like how we're going to be operating. I'm not sure if you were suggesting that it's like a trend right now, but I do think it's the future.
I think by nature, sales programs and go-to-market plays teams are very cross-functional, Lauren. And a lot of companies that we struggle with kind of get in their own metrics and are very focused on sort of like how they can generate an outcome for their org, not necessarily think about the bigger picture. Do you have any tips for folks of what has been most successful for you around breaking down those barriers between functions and orgs?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something I said earlier, which is tell the impact story, and tell it well, and make sure that it's a future-oriented vision that people can get bought into in the future. Because the more that you can have the sales leaders, the executives, and cross-functional partners and stakeholders bought into that, I think that, people are really excited about that. And then you have a whole story to tell along the way until you get there, right? We're here, right? We said we wanted to be here, and we're here right now. We know what we're measuring because we've all aligned on what we're going to measure. A big learning for me at Intercom when we launched a new value selling methodology was, everyone was coming to the table with an opinion on what to measure. And we said, okay, let's sit back and just figure out what the story is that we want to tell. What's the future vision that we want to inhabit in a year, right? And what does it look like at 6 months? And what does it look like at a month? And what are the signals, rep behaviors, activities, leading and lagging indicators that we need to look at? Obviously, the signals were, and rep activities were all about adoption. So those are pretty standardized. But what was surprising was instead of, measuring a laundry list of items, what it really came down to in order to prove out that we were, delivering the impact that we were expecting were two metrics that were not what we thought, right? The story that we wanted to tell is that we launched Command of the Message to all customer-facing roles in February, March of 2024. The methodology equips reps to lead with compelling, consistent go-to-market messaging with customers and enables them to build and capture value in all sales conversations, which leads to higher competitive win rates and less negotiation and discounting of our solutions. Widely adopted by sales teams, we've seen a considerable increase in reps using the specific language of the methodology in recorded calls. And there's a strong correlation between evidence of the methodology execution in these calls and wins. Because reps are focusing more on discovery with customers, we've also seen a measurable increase in MEDPIC fields filled out by reps for their key opportunities, leading to greater big deal predictability. SOPS has reported an increase in S2 to S3, right, showing higher opportunity conversion rate, indicating reps are executing discovery better and new messaging is resonating with customers. We've also reported a decrease in time in S4, which further indicates that reps are building more value on the front end of deals and thereby able to capture value during the negotiation stage. So this is to say that we ended up measuring stage progression from S2 to S3 and time in S4, which is not what we would have thought we were going to measure if we hadn't actually told that story, got buy-in on the story, got cross-functional input on the metrics that really matter.
In terms of risk, I feel like if you don't implement sales programs or go-to-market programs at your organization, if you don't heed this warning that RevOps is shifting and changing, if you don't start to implement either AI tooling through your existing tech stack or think about how to leverage it to drive, to support, some of these go-to-market architecture, building blocks. What's the risk of not sort of taking some of these more innovative approaches to go-to-market operations and enablement into your organization today?
I see a lot of rep burnout. So that's one risk. The more that you can enable reps to be more productive, more efficient, more streamlined in their workflows, the more you help them set them up for success, selling your solutions with customers. So there's that. And I just see, again, I think I said this before, but inefficiency throughout the entire sales process, right? So, I joined Ironclad and was asking, what are the industries or segments where we win the most? And I was told by a lot of leaders, what's wonderful about contract lifecycle management and our solution is that we could sell to anybody, any size of customer, any industry, any segment. And, the opportunity is just so, huge. But that shows you how much, if you have that mindset, right, which is great. I agree with that to a certain degree. You have so much inefficiency in your pipeline, so much inefficiency in your sales process. If you're not truly defining your ICP and then really honing in on the companies and accounts that are in your ICP that are already engaging with you, that are aware of your brand, and moving those companies through the funnel, right? So I think it's just a risk that, you're not really strategically seizing the opportunity ahead of you.
You talked about you kind of alluded to this, but I want to go further on how do you balance the short-term goals and the long-term goals, right? I think sometimes revenue leaders, marketing leaders, et cetera, can kind of get caught up in how do we just hit the number this week versus setting yourself up for sustained success in pipeline building. Just a few thoughts on how you balance the sort of short versus longer term challenges.
Yeah, I think that I'm always seeking to run experiments that produce results and scale those results and get more and more cross-functional buy-in on, hey, this is working. Let's scale this further. Let's extend it to a different team. So my first response there would be to say that producing results, I think, that sales leaders and executives care about in the short term will always lead to long-term sustainable results over time. And, I just think earning the trust of your stakeholders and your sales leaders and, cross-functional partners I think that's the most important critical ingredient for success long-term, because that just yields so many more returns, right? Getting their buy-in and support on the initiatives that you're running when you know you have another initiative that will drive similar level of impact, like everyone's on board. So I would say that, running experiments, proving out the value and impact of those experiments, scaling them into full-scale initiatives, and making sure that they're always going to be, continuing to deepen that trust and alignment with leaders and cross-functional partners.
You make such a good point around the trust thing paying dividends, in terms of if you run those experiments and they go wrong, you still have to maintain that handshake, that like support from those folks to go and continue to run new experiments until you find the one that really works that you can scale. And it's such a great point that, like, without that, you end up starting or trying a few things, and then they sort of like push the entire concept of programs to the side.
Lauren, so this is the final question, and it's one that we ask all of our guests. Who is the smartest person you've ever known, and what did you learn from them?
Okay. I hope I'm the first to say this, but it's actually my husband. He is always right, and it's pretty annoying. But no, really, he is actually the most brilliant person I know. He is also the most intuitive, and we both have our PhDs. I think he's much more brilliant than any professor, or any person that I ever worked with at my time at University of Chicago. But he's always reminding me that the rational and the logical ways of thinking have their limits, and that you need to trust your intuition. And I love that about him, because you can be book smart, you can be learned, you can have all the expertise in the world, but if you're really not in tune with your intuition, like, you're missing out on such a huge part of, just trusting yourself, I would say. So
thank you so much for spending the time with us and joining us on the ZoomInfo Labs podcast. As mentioned, we've learned so much from you over the years, and we should do this again.
Likewise, you guys are amazing, and I've learned so much from you, and a lot of what I've said has been so deeply informed by our discussions.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the ZoomInfo Labs podcast.
With new episodes dropping every Monday and Thursday, subscribe to the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me and Ben on LinkedIn, and visit zoominfo.com/labs to get in touch.